Good morning. I declare open the Listed Council Legal and Social Issue Committee public hearing for the inquiry into drugs, poison and controlled substance amendment, regulation for personal adult use of cannabis bill 2023. Please ensure that mobile phones have been switched to silence, that background noise is minimised. Before we continue, I would like to begin this hearing by respectfully acknowledging the Aboriginal people, the traditional custodian of the various land that we gather on today. I pay my respect to their ancestors, elders and family. I particularly welcome any elders or community members who are here today impart their knowledge of this issue to the committee. Welcome to the member of public watching via live broadcast. Before I continue, I'd like to introduce the member of my committees. To my right is my Deputy Chair, Mr Ryan Batchelor. And to the further right, Mr Michael Lear.
Good morning.
And Mr Lee Kamanis. And Mr Abe Ayali. And to my left is Miss Rachel Payne.
Hello.
And joining us also Mr David Higashake.
Good morning.
Morning, gentlemen. My name's Chung Lu. With us today, also, sorry, my fault. And also joining us today, also Mr Joe McCracken on Zoom, and also a bit later on, Ms Renee, Dr Renee Heath is joining us as well. With us today, joining us today in participating, it's got people, two doctors from the Burnet Institute, Dr Michael Curtis and Professor Paul Diaz, and also from the Alcohol and Drug Foundation, Mr Robert Taylor. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Just before we continue, I just want to read some information to you. All evidence is protected by parliamentary privilege as provided by the Constitution Act 1975 and further subject to the revision of the Listed Council standing orders. Therefore, the information you provide during this hearing is protected by law. You are protected against any actions for what you say during this hearing. But if you go elsewhere and repeat the same thing, those comments may not be protected by this privilege. Any deliberately false evidence or misleading to the committee may be considered a contempt of Parliament. All evidence is being recorded. You will be provided a approved version of the transcript following the hearing. The transcript will be ultimately made public and posted on the committee website. For recording purpose, could you please state your full name and organisation you're appearing on behalf of, please?
Michael Curtis from the Burnet Institute.
Thank you.
Paul Dietz from the Burnet Institute.
And I'm Robert Taylor from the Alcohol and Drug Foundation.
Thank you. Good morning. So I know you made your submission, but I'd like to invite you each to have an opening statement before we proceed for the member ask questions.
We'll see how we go with the PowerPoint. We actually brought a presentation that we might just quickly run through. So Michael's put this together, but I speak to it, and we can just sort of tag team, yeah.
Yep.
So. Well, we're getting somewhere. So, yeah, we always acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands on which we work. The main office of the Burnet Institute is housed on the lands of the Boonwurrung people, and we respectfully acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and just highlight that many of the issues related to drugs specifically play very heavily in First Nations communities. I don't seem to have any control over this. Oh, here we go. So we basically, in our submission, really made reference to our previous submission in relation to the inquiry into the use of cannabis in Victoria that we put in 2020. And basically we were arguing that there should be de jure changes to cannabis policy. We suggested that everything should be framed within a public health framework rather than a law enforcement framework, which is essentially where we are at the moment. We recommended that international models of cannabis regulation get reviewed, and because there's so many variations and so many vagaries to all of the different models that exist now. But we did say that whatever path was chosen really does need a very strong regulatory framework, and we're basically trying to caution against some of the most liberal commercial markets that exist in some of the some parts of the US in particular, and highlight the need for strict monitoring and evaluation, which is something that's absent from a lot of the changes that have taken place in the US in particular. But one of the things that we really want to highlight is that if there is any change like this, that we need to expunge previous convictions, because they do impact on people's lives. And one of the things that we've spoken to these committees before in relation to is the fact that some people are walking around with charges that really do need to be removed from their records so that they don't, so they're not at risk when they're in the community. So basically, in terms of the current amendment bill, basically we understand that it allows the lawful possession and use of cannabis and cannabis cultivation products, and it permits the lawful cultivation of up to 6 plants by people over age 18 on their principal private residence, and it allows gifting for adults over 18. And I mean, they're the 3 key features, and it's a relatively simple amendment. Obviously, canvassing a huge change. And our basic position is that we support the ideas presented here as a kind of first step. We expect that there'd be a major reduction in criminal justice involvement for people, with 11,000 cannabis consumer-related arrests in 2020 to 2021. That's a huge burden on police and the community, and we're seeing this debate around policing resources at the moment, and this is one of the things that takes up a lot of time from police, as well as the people who are obviously charged as well. And in many respects, the model share, and I know the committee were in the ACT, I think, yesterday. I know the model shares a lot with the ACT existing model that's there now, and the evidence that is just coming to the fore in the ACT is that there's really negligible changes in cannabis use and related harms, and obviously the decriminalisation has essentially meant that people aren't being arrested anymore, which is a huge removal of a big burden. But we think that there's still further to go, in that we think that the market could go further, and we see this as some kind of first step towards a heavily regulated sort of quasi-commercial market, which would enable stricter potency controls, which are what is one of the major concerns that people have around cannabis law reform. It would also allow taxation revenue to be generated. And I think any inroads we can make to remove the illicit market are really important. I mean, there may be some unintended consequences as well, which I think we come to in a couple of slides. But I mean, essentially, do I actually have control or not? I do. Just in terms of this, many of you will have seen this U-shape of law policy options, and basically, we need to find the right part of the U-shape. So we don't want an unregulated legal market, such as in Colorado and so on, leads to these high potency products that are potentially very dangerous, whereas the unregulated criminal market that we have at the moment is something that's obviously leading to a lot of arrests and a lot of things that we'd rather avoid. And ultimately, we need to learn from the alcohol and tobacco markets, is what we're saying. And I think this is a sensible first step towards what we think is where we should eventually land. So the next slide will, basically, so we're a public health organisation. It's not surprising that we say that we should be prioritising public health. We need evaluation and monitoring. We're a research organisation. We're going to say that too. But it is really important to properly understand the impacts of these sorts of things. And we do think that there is further to go, though. Alternative models of legalisation could achieve additional benefits with state-owned monopolies and so on, which in the lesson from alcohol in relation to that is pretty clear too. So it's not surprising that we'd be advocating the same for cannabis. But one of I think the next slide has a couple of things about the cannabis clubs, which are not-for-profit associations that are officially registered, where people can essentially supply within the club. It gives the potential benefit of peer education and so on. You have illicit cannabis for people who can't grow, and we'll come back to that in a minute. There's limited pressure for market expansion compared to those commercial models in Colorado and other places that we talked about. We can't control prices, and there's limited economic benefit here because you don't raise taxation from those clubs in the way that they run. But on the next slide, state-owned monopoly, as I said, builds on the alcohol sort of frameworks that have been implemented in various countries. So the Nordic countries actually have alcohol monopolies, and it means that the government monopoly over, in particular, retail sales means that you've got product regulation, you've got government revenue coming in, and all sorts of controls that go with that. I mean, ultimately, though, there is the potential offside with all of these things that we might see slight increases in cannabis use, which we've seen overseas. But returning back to the bill, which I think the next slide does, the issue that's been raised by a number of people is just the fact that the current bill is referring to people who have a principal place of residence, which means that people who are homeless will have difficulty benefiting from the change, and they're the ones who are often at risk in relation to sort of policing and things that go with that. And also with the size of the plants that people can grow, it's pretty easy to get over the trafficable quantity. So we suggest that there really does need to be changes relating to what is the threshold for a trafficable quantity. And there is some evidence that people get anxious about this, what they're growing and so on. But ultimately the proposal that we see many benefits in the proposal and think that it is an important first step.
Okay, well, just mindful of time.
Yep.
There'll be time for us to ask you a question as well. I'd like to quickly invite Robert to make a quick opening statement before we...
I actually, would only be repeating what Paul's just said. We're of a very similar mind. I think I'll just say briefly, we're very supportive of the provisions in this bill. We think it removes, by removing the criminal charges associated with possession and use of cannabis, you're removing, it's quite simply a harm that has been ineffective at actually A, changing behaviour, and B, improving public health in any meaningful way, and it has served as a kind of detriment to public health. So this bill, by removing that quite simply, we believe should improve outcomes, social outcomes, and increase people's personal liberty. Everything that Paul said around the steps beyond this, again, we agree with. That U-shaped curve that was demonstrated is really what we're searching for, that point that minimises harm, basically trying to find a way to make something available in the community that can be harmful, but trying to make it available in a way that minimises harm is the goal. So happy to take your questions.
Thank you. Just mindful of time. I'll quickly open up a question, then I'll pass on to the rest of the committee. Just with respect to you to Alcohol Foundation submissions. In your summary, the two recommendations that you put forward in submissions, the second one, you recommend that the bill to be amended to remove criminal penalties for personal cannabis use and possession by people who are under 18. It is, through our inquiries, there are really research and academics who suggest that, and also in ACT, they prohibit those who are under 18 possession and use of cannabis due to health reasons down the track. I was wondering, can you extend on your recommendation why criminal penalties for personal use and possession by people under 18? Or your recommendation, please?
Yeah, well, we certainly don't want people under 18 using cannabis. I think I'll say that as a start. But the reality is young people do use cannabis, just the way young people drink. What's been really effective over the last kind of couple of decades in lowering youth drinking rates hasn't been criminalising alcohol, right? It's been a combination of education, public health campaigns, changes to advertising regulation and so on. So it's through this kind of wide variety of, or suite of measures that we've actually managed to drive down youth alcohol use. And similarly, we would say the best way to prevent young people from using something while their brain's developing is to do it via a public health approach like we have with alcohol. Criminalisation, we know, just pushes people into the margins. Putting someone through the justice system at a young age is disengages them from school, disengages them from their peer group, disengages them from protective factors like sports, hobbies, family, and so on, all of which can contribute to further risk of harm down the track, further risk of harm from substances or other issues. So criminalisation we don't see as serving any purpose. We see it actually as being a genuine harm and creating further risk of harm. And it does very little to deter young people. We know that. We know that for deterrence to be effective in law, there has to be a high likelihood of someone being detected. Otherwise, the application of the law is really unequal. Certain communities get policed more than others, and so they bear the brunt of that law while others continue to use cannabis with no deterrent effect and aren't policed. So, yes, that's what I would say to that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks very much, everyone, for coming along. Professor Dietz, I might just start. You talked about your alternative, sort of more preferable options. You say there's a bit of a missed opportunity. There are better ways to go about it. I'm not going to dwell on my reflections on the capacity of not-for-profit clubs to be a malignant influence on public health. Our examples of the use of electronic gaming machines in particular is probably a good case study of why that's not necessarily a panacea. But particularly on the sort of government monopoly on retail sales, we know it's worked in other jurisdictions with alcohol. That model, though, is it consistent? Would it be able to be done consistently if this bill took a first step towards personal legalisation of personal cultivation and supply?
I think absolutely. I mean, because the gifting component of it would sort of enable a quasi version of a regulated market as a first step, and then beyond that, though, I think if there is like in the ACT good evidence that there's no kind of major impacts, then I think it makes sense to go to that next stage where there is a monopoly, and we've seen there's a recent article that's just come out that's done a comparison of the controlled monopoly versus kind of the more liberal areas in Canada, isn't it?
Yes. So there's a recent paper published in the last week or two in the Lancet Public Health that's reviewed outcomes on a variety of fronts relating to sort of comparing before and after cannabis legalisation in America and in Canada. And there's a lot of conflicting findings within there, which isn't surprising given the variety of models that are used both within America and Canada. But one of the clear themes that does come through is the lower rates of cannabis-related harms in the state of Quebec, where they are probably the only jurisdiction running a quite tightly regulated state-owned monopoly. So one of the clear examples, just looking within Canada, compares childhood poisonings from sort of
Gummies and stuff.
from gummies, yeah, exactly. And clear evidence of much lower rates of childhood poisonings in Quebec, where they don't actually allow those products and have much tighter controls compared to, I think it's Ontario and Alberta, where they have much stronger or much bigger retail markets and allow those products.
Just conscious of giving my colleagues a chance. You say there needs to be lessons learned from the current state of the tobacco and alcohol markets, particularly looking at the current state of the tobacco market, which is in the news constantly. What do you think the big lessons that we need to be drawing from that are when thinking about how to move forward with cannabis regulation in Victoria?
Well, so yeah, there's so I mean, ultimately, there is the my own personal view in relation to the tobacco issue at the moment is that the pricing is creating opportunities for the illicit market to have emerged, and the pricing is a really useful tool for reducing consumption to a point, but I think we've probably reached that point and we've probably gone beyond it. And so that would be one lesson, is that you wouldn't want to create a pricing regime that would mean that the illicit market would continue to flourish because it could be undercut. And what we've seen...
Particularly by people growing it at home. People don't grow tobacco at home, I suppose.
Yeah, true. And we've seen in the US that the undercutting that people were concerned about with some of the monopolies, I think it was in Washington, they haven't actually seen that because people are so, sort of happy that it's no longer, it's not an illegal thing, that they're happy to pay a little bit more than what they might have in the past. So I think pricing is a key issue that would need to be considered, and that's one of the lessons. But also things like major controls on marketing and advertising and so on, which we're failing on in relation to a whole range of commodities and behaviours. But we, that's as Rob was saying, that's one of the lessons from alcohol and tobacco is removing marketing of any type. I think plain packaging is an appropriate option. Those sorts of things are things that we'd argue should be endorsed.
I could go on all day, but I'll leave it there. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Rachel?
Thank you, Trong, and thank you to you all for making a submission to this inquiry. It's been really helpful information, and it has sort of helped form a lot of the questioning that's coming out today, but also just reflecting on the capabilities of the bill as well. So on that point, Robert, in the ADF submission, there is mention of the bill should be amended to include provisions regarding safety and storage of cannabis products, just to ensure that it's not accessible to people under the age of 18, and that's a reflection on the ACT legislation. Would you mind expanding on that a little bit more, and maybe even considering, should we also be looking at how plants are being stored and kept in the home environment as well as part of this bill?
Yeah, this is a really delicate legal area because the enforceability of these laws for someone's backyard is really low, basically. We wouldn't be expecting police to be door knocking and looking in people's backyards. We wouldn't want that to be the case. But that being said, we also don't want people to be behaving in a kind of maybe negligent manner with regards to making cannabis accessible to people who it might not be appropriate for, like young people. So whether that is through having something that's kind of symbolic within the legislation that's there around, just ensuring that it is stored safely, might be worth considering. But that being said, we already do have very potent medications that people take home from pharmacists that don't have those kind of legal requirements around them. So I'm not sure if we've got a strong answer for you there, but just wanted to raise that it does, raise some issues.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think it's, when we spent some time with the ACT police, it didn't seem like it was an issue, but I think having that as part of the legislation just means that there's that level of expectation there.
Yeah.
So that makes sense. Wanting to talk more about the idea around historical convictions and expunging those convictions, would you mind expanding a little bit further on the implications of having a conviction, but also how you would see that would be part of a broader reform when it came to cannabis reform more broadly?
So, one of the things that Simon Lenton did a lot of work around was just the sort of social impacts of having a cannabis arrest and conviction, and the fact that it limits your opportunities around a whole range of different things, including things like obtaining a historical cannabis conviction can stop you from getting a liquor license if you want to trade as a hotel or something like that. It limits some employment opportunities and things, and so it seems if we move to a point where we have essentially de jure legalisation, we should really expunge those convictions so that people are no longer affected by them. And that's the fundamental of it. Yep.
Have I got time for one more question, Sean?
Come back here.
Yeah.
Michael?
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. Thank you for joining us. I might start with you, Professor Dietz. In your submission, you concentrate on the need for a public health approach to certain at-risk individuals, and including specifying individuals with a history of psychosis or first-degree relative with a history of psychosis. How does cannabis contribute to psychosis in some people?
Do you want to
Sure. So, I mean, the evidence for a causal pathway between cannabis use and schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders is still somewhat contentious. It would be leaning towards there being a small elevated risk during a sort of finite period of time, generally adolescence into early adulthood, sort of thinking about that 15 to 25-year-old period. However, so we are talking a fairly small absolute risk, though. So there is a likely contributing factor there for some additional risk.
Is it likely that it exacerbates potentially a genetic factor?
Exactly. Yeah. So I mean, if cannabis had the same risk for causing schizophrenia for everybody in the general population, then we should see rates of schizophrenia in the community increasing at the same rate of cannabis use.
Is there a way of screening? For example, I might have a relative who has had complications as a result of cannabis use. Is there a way for me to hypothetically then test whether I would be affected in the same way?
I'm not aware of any simple test for that kind of thing, but that sort of, to be honest, that sort of precision medicine is something that may well be coming, but at the moment I'm not aware of any kind of testing like that.
And would it be something that you would view that under a decriminalisation model, having that public health approach would enable earlier interventions in people who do experience those symptoms?
Absolutely, and that's the focus. So instead of trying to police that, let's have early intervention.
Sorry, I was just going to say one of the things you haven't mentioned. One of the benefits of decriminalisation is destigmatisation. Stigma is just such a massive factor when it comes to both alcohol and drugs and people seeking help. The median time that it takes someone to seek treatment for alcohol use issues in Australia is about 17 years. We know cannabis, while it's not considered as bad in those terms as some other drugs, there's still a lot of stigma around seeking help. And that's really poor for public health.
Of course. Mr. Taylor, your submission talks about the ACT model and how they also had the SCON, the Simple Cannabis Offence Notice, for around 25 to 30 years before decriminalisation. To what extent do you attribute the very positive results we saw in the ACT? To what extent do you attribute that to the fact that they already had that system in place for such a long time?
It's an interesting question. I'm not sure I can give you a strong evidence-based answer to that. I would say though that with regards to the offence notices, one of our kind of key issues with those is that they still someone still incurs a penalty, right? And that penalty is still regressive in the sense that someone on a lower income, whether it's $100 or $150, that's going to take up a larger portion of their income. And in those cases when they didn't take up that notice, there was still the risk of criminalisation beyond that. So, that's what you might call an enhanced diversion scheme, and we're seeing more of that, which is beneficial. But truly, we think for decriminalisation to work in its fullest, in a de jure sense, you really have to remove that offence fully from the legislation.
Thank you. I'd love to ask more. Maybe we'll have time later. Thank you, Chair.
David?
Thank you, Chair. Firstly, thank you very much for your contributions, and it's greatly appreciated. Looking at the relationship between what we're putting up in this bill and Canberra, we've now had with the ACT obviously the statutory review, and we've had, I guess, the Lambert Initiative's review of the review as well as of the statutory review as well as the bill. I guess I'd be interested in your insights as to the degree to which the bill that's being proposed picks up absences in the Canberra legislation, or the ACT legislation, and perhaps also what's missing, recognising that it obviously doesn't have the regulated market.
I'd start with one point. So I think the slightly higher number of plants within this bill probably makes sense if one of the aims is to try and make inroads against the illicit market. So one of the papers published in the last couple of weeks that I reference in my slides notes that sort of respondents to that survey, quite a few noted that 4 plants wasn't enough for them to actually meet their daily cannabis requirements, which were relatively low at roughly a gram a day. They were still potentially running out before their next plants were ready to be harvested. But of course that then, as we noted, raises issues how that, and potential inconsistency with the current threshold quantities.
I'd just add that there's been that issue in the ACT legislation around seeds and access to seeds, and so I think picking that up here is really sensible.
There is a certain metaphysical quality to 4 plants without seeds or cuttings, but yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I guess one of the things that's also come up in discussion is that the definition of weight, and particularly I think wet weight. Comments?
This is a big issue across every drug, and because for an individual in possession, it is sometimes easier for someone to just weigh what they have rather than trying to calculate in their head, do I have X dry weight? Yes, it's a complicated issue. I don't know if we have a strong opinion either way.
When we met with the New South Wales the ACT police, they indicated that they didn't actually bother policing weight, and they simply went with plant numbers. Does that sound sensible?
Look, I think it does, but I would be concerned about the sort of potential for inequitable application of the law if that wasn't then aligned with the threshold quantities. We know that some, as Robert said before, some communities get policed in different ways to others, and I think this is a particularly sensitive area where removing any ambiguity in the law would be beneficial. So if they kept just plant numbers, so as the bill currently stands, unless I'm mistaken, there is that inconsistency where if those 6 plants yielded more than 50 grams of cannabis in a single harvest, if they're harvested once, then they're potentially at risk of a trafficking charge. Police discretion, if it's correct there, police discretion could be applied in that scenario, but may not be.
Chair, maybe if I can just help the witness clarify.
Sorry,
In the bill, the draft bill that's before
Mm.
consideration, there is no definition, or there's no weight for wet cannabis defined.
Yeah.
Only for dry and on
Yes.
your person.
Yeah.
Does that assist you in responding?
I'd have to think it through.
Yeah. Yeah. If I can take that on notice.
Please take it
Yeah.
on notice by all means.
Yeah.
That'd be great. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Mr. McCracken, can you hear us? I'd like to ask some questions. Thank you, Joe.
Yeah, can everyone hear me okay? I had a couple of questions first for the Burnet Institute. I want to know more about the liberal markets that you would probably have more caution with. What are the characteristics of those markets, and what is it about them that you'd caution? And I think you said before they need more monitoring and evaluation. Can you just expand on that, please?
So it's essentially the flip side of what I was saying earlier about the lessons from tobacco. So where there's a free market where potency isn't controlled, the types of products aren't controlled, and marketing and advertising are basically uncontrolled as well. And so there's examples of that in the US. And, so we're advocating that we would want much stricter market controls so that those things are heavily regulated. And in terms of monitoring and evaluation, there is no, for some of the states in the US, there's literally no evaluation framework set up prior to them establishing their models. And so as a consequence, it's been very piecemeal and patchy, those sorts of evidence that's come together to try and evaluate what the impacts have been. And that means that we end up in the position now, more than 10 years late after a lot of these reforms, where we don't really know what the impacts of these unregulated markets are. We're getting a better sense with some of the more tightly regulated ones, and I know a lot of the Europeans who are European countries moving to a different regime have set up evaluation frameworks, which I think is exactly what we'd want to do in this instance too.
Yep, no, that's fair enough. And I guess I have another question. This sort of for both as well. The ADF. I'm interested, and it's been raised quite a bit about the gifting provisions. Are there ways around the gifting provisions at all that you can see?
Around in what sense? You mean?
Well, I mean, if I say to you, here's, 50 grams of cannabis, it's a gift. Other ways around it say, oh, well, later on you can give me, I don't know, $50 or something. I don't know how much they cost, but, those sort of things.
So how it would actually play out, I don't think we have a good sense of that yet, because I don't know that there's any other regime equivalent. So I think that's exactly what the sort of thing you'd want to monitor.
And
properly
it sort of goes
understand.
to what I was getting at before about. So how would you monitor and sort of scrutinise those sorts of provisions?
I guess I'd probably just say that's already happening. That would be my only comment, is that's kind of exactly what we already have, which is that going on. So while, yes, the policing or enforcement around gifting this would be challenging, I personally see that as no different to what is currently occurring. People selling cannabis for money with very little policing around it. And if anything, opens up a framework for people to engage in that behaviour that's not going to lead to greater harm, as Paul mentioned, with the associated charges and their harms.
I think my time's up, but thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Lee?
I'm happy to cede my time, Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. I think both groups here today, we've talked about the policing of the current laws and the impacts that's having on the community. Are you able to expand a bit more on what we're seeing right now and why this bill can seek to address those concerns?
Well, so there's a couple of things in response. So we often find, we run prospective cohort studies of people who use drugs. So basically we recruit them into the study and then we follow them up over time to see how things progress for them. And what most of our studies are focused on people who inject drugs and people who smoke methamphetamine and so on. And what we find is that they often will find the way in which the cannabis laws are policed means that they'll essentially, the police will be targeting them for injecting drug use, but they'll use cannabis charges to actually get them and arrest them, because they might not have any kind of injectable drug on them, but they might have a small amount of cannabis. So that's one of the impacts of the laws at the moment, is that it's this kind of net widening, and the discretion that goes around policing in this space is something that is ideally not what we want. And then obviously the 11,000 arrests that happened in 2020, 2021, I mean, that's a huge burden on the police force, but also stress and all of those sorts of things that go with it. And then, if people get diverted into a program, it's taking away other resources that could be used for drugs that people are struggling with more, and so on. So it's all of those sorts of things come into it.
Thank you.
Yeah, look, we know in general between kind of 80 to 90% of people that use a specific substance won't be dependent on that substance. And so, in fact, the greatest harm that they may experience from their use may actually be the risk of associated with the criminalisation, rather than the risk of harm from the substance itself. And then for those 10 to 20% who are dependent on the substance, criminalisation does nothing but push them away from the support that they really need. I've worked in prisons, in kind of drug and alcohol programs in prisons, and yes, look, it's an opportunity to work with people, but it's not the best opportunity. Working with people in the community, without them having this kind of thing over them that's going to kind of impact their life more negatively, preventing criminalisation is going to be a much better way of approaching that.
Thank you. And for our Burnet Institute representatives today, you were talking about the number of plants and the implications that can have for whether someone has access to their own homegrown cannabis year round. Does this bill get it right in terms of the number of plants, and what are the risks if we don't have sufficient supply in that scenario?
Yeah, so insufficient supply would reduce the potential of this bill to make inroads against the illicit market. I'm not sure whether 6 is exactly the right number. We need some really good data on sort of daily cannabis use, production from plants, etc., to actually nail a number down there. But based on the experience from the ACT and one of the papers in the slides there, it would suggest that it would go closer to that.
Thank you.
Okay, a quick question, Michael.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks again. Dr. Curtis, in one of your previous answers, I believe you referenced the Lambert study. May have been just again now. One of the interesting things I found from that was that it found that the average THC concentration amongst the sample plants was around 9%, whereas the average for the number of the average of plants that were seized through criminal operations was 15%. Would I be right to assume that the higher the THC, the higher the risk? And if so, what does that change in risk profile look like from 9 to 15 and beyond?
So yes, firstly, the higher the THC content, the potential, the greater potential risk for cannabis-related harms. Sorry, what was the second part?
What's the difference between the risk of 9% as compared to 15? I know it can't be precise on those numbers, but broadly speaking, in those ranges, what are we talking about in terms of a difference?
It's a really difficult question to answer because we don't know how people may be titrating their cannabis consumption relative to the strength of the cannabis that they're consuming. So for risks to increase, we'd be making the assumption that they're consuming the same weight of cannabis with a greater strength. But we do know that many people will reduce the amount that they use. So I'm not sure that I can provide a clear answer to that question.
Sure. We know the study also shows that of those who have cultivated their own, there was an increase in the amount that they use. Now we know that the overall trend for use, the number of people taking it has actually stabilised, if not decreased. But the study also showed that there was an increase, I think, I don't have the stat here, but maybe about 28% of existing users. Does that counterbalance any other potential benefits of lower THC?
Yeah, potentially. I mean, because increased frequency of use does potentially increase the risk of harm.
It's a simple, yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Just quick. Yeah,
Thank you, Chair. Your submission, it's an independent review of international cannabis legalisation models, needs to be undertaken before any moves to legalise cannabis in Victoria. Would you consider an expert advisory panel to be the appropriate mechanism to conduct an independent review? And who would you see that would be included in that? What stakeholders or sectors would be included?
Sure, I think that makes a lot of sense, and certainly, the standard health law enforcement stakeholders should be included. But I think, given the social situation and context, you'd really want to be thinking about housing and other representatives in there as well.
Yeah, consumer voice.
Yeah, and that's absolutely, that's something that's been missing in so much is, consumer perspectives on changes. So.
Okay. Would you like to take that on notice if you wanted to add more thought to that? Yeah,
Sure.
That'd be great.
Yeah,
Thank
absolutely.
Thank you, Rachel. Well, just because of the time, thank you so much, gentlemen, for coming in and give us a chance to speak to and be able to use submissions.
Thank you for the
On behalf of the
opportunity.
committee, thank you much for your time.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.